So one thing that we are constantly reading about or hearing from our clients is discussions on their company or organizational culture. And I know from our previous conversations, we all understand the importance of culture, but looking to have a little bit of a discussion today on what are some of the attributes that you guys feel or have seen that really are part of any and every high-performing culture?
I think it all starts with clear goals and expectations of the team, and exactly what kind of behavior are you looking for. So the leadership has to be all in aligned and taking us forward on a goal, a path that meets the cultures of the organization.
Clear goals, great.
I think consistency in the culture also, just if you're going to say something, this is what you're going to do. So making sure that you stick by those goals that you set.
I think trust in creating an environment where people are able to show up as that best version of themselves for the organization.
And establishing shared values that are visible, easy for people to continuously refer back to.
Those are all great and really something that we can understand and grasp onto. But I want to dig in a little bit more, Adam, to what you started with, which is belonging. Why is belonging so important to culture?
With culture, you want people to be aligned and making the goal of the organization, which is that sense of belonging, not themselves, maybe not their best friend inside the organization, but to put priority first and foremost, that mission, that goal, that purpose, and it trumps everything else. So any disconnects with relationships melt away, and it lends itself to over communicating because people want that goal to be successful. They want to belong to it.
And I think along with that, to piggyback on what you said, it's also about retention of that talent. Because if people don't feel like they belong, then they're going to want to leave your organization. So making sure that you cultivate that to where you keep that retention of talent.
And the same thought of belonging, I think when we feel like we belong to a group, we have more buy-in, we have more commitment to whatever we're looking to achieve. And I think that the more buy-in we get from the group, the more ownership the group takes over keeping that culture or morphing it if it needs to be, but keeping a strong sense of culture to keep us moving in the direction we need to go.
Those are great. John, let me ask you or start with you for the next question. Where would a company begin if they want to mature or evolve or transform their culture?
Yeah, I think there's probably two things to that. The first one is go back to the goals, right? Probably setting down, walking through exactly what kind of objectives that the company wants, what kind of behavior are you looking for? Are you looking for integrity and value? Of course you do. Sounds easy, but driving it through the organization is always difficult. And then, how do you maintain it once you grab it, right? And how do you hold people accountable? Because if you don't hold people accountable and you allow someone to slip from the values that you've already placed in front of the team, then you're going to lose it just as fast as you can gain it. So I think that there's a yin and a yang there a little bit. Reward people for doing values and following the team, and then of course disciplining those who don't. And that is always really hard to do.
And sometimes you just need to start at what is our reality, right? When we're looking at what is our culture, if you don't know where you're currently at, you don't know where you need to go, and it's hard to kind of create that path moving forward.
And I think figuring out how do you measure that reality, right? How do we understand what is that reality of culture when culture is a byproduct of how people feel, which is a really hard thing to measure. And so creating those feedback loops, having this constant flow of communication so that you're not building a culture just from the top. You really truly understand how people feel, where they feel disconnected, and where that trust is broken, and that's a starting point.
Because that will go back to Adam's point of really building and growing that sense of belonging.
I think when you have a sense of belonging, you have shared values, you know where the organization wants to go, that develops a sense of camaraderie or a sense of family in the organization, where you feel like you owe it to the people you work with every day to bring your best, that they deserve your best. You want to give them everything you have rather than just show up and do your job on any given occasion.
So it's that Aristotle quote that the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. What are some initiatives that you guys have done or seen within a company to really start to get to where you are today versus where you want to go to grow that inclusive or belonging culture?
A lot of times it's as simple as taking your eye off the goals of the organization and just allowing the natural rapport to take place over something where there's not pressure on a deadline. So a more social gathering. The problem with that sometimes is that it gets forced. So I think culturally speaking, if you could just try to build it into the routine of the company where there's space for people to connect and build personal rapport, can be a stepping stone in the right direction to have better culture.
I think if you're struggling to see that evolve, you can take some deliberate steps to maybe specify certain groups of individuals. Maybe you start with your small team that's immediately around you and kind of get the juices flowing and figure out what you think is important to those you work with, what's important to you, and then you socialize that idea. You crowdsource it in maybe an anonymous type of setting so people feel free to say how they feel and bring forward their opinions.
And I think with the senior leadership, what I've seen is senior leadership has to verbalize. They need to write it down. People need to be able to see every day, okay, this is the culture of our organization, number one. Number two, getting to the point to where you get that buy-in, to where people understand. And if there are some rumble strips in there to where they don't really understand, making sure they understand, because you want them to have that what's in it for me as a part of the organization. And then not necessarily setting timelines or anything like that, but just setting intermediate goals to say, hey, this is how we want to check our organization to make sure that we're following it. Because if we're not, then let's reevaluate so that we can make it better.
Because culture is a behemoth. So doing those smaller milestones so that we can grow together.
One bite at a time.
Gotcha. So culture change, I can see that people are like, we need a better culture. Let's get on it. By next quarter, we'll be good. What is realistic in your experience as a leader or within your coaching clients? What is realistic to understand and expect on this journey of culture maturation or culture change?
The timeline to change culture is a long one. I think it should be seen more generationally and not measured in weeks, months, or even years, but just to appreciate that there's different generations within an organization. And I think the marker of understanding it's accomplished is from the bottom up, where the bottom up is driving the culture you want and it's not coming from the top down.
I would say that if you set achievable, realistic goals, you can also gain a lot of momentum. So knowing that it's going to take generations to change the culture of an organization, especially if it's a very large organization, if you start just taking that one bite at a time again and be very specific about what you're trying to do and know that that's going to build toward that generational difference. I think that gives a lot of affirmation to people and helps them feel like their work is meaningful and they're accomplishing something.
I think one of the biggest things you can do to sabotage a culture shift is to fixate on timelines, which we do so often. There's goals, that's what you're measured by, and there has to be a measure of success. But what that means is that you are taking a single point measurement of how people feel, of how they trust their organization, of values, and then you're continuously measuring back to that instead of focusing on those feedback loops, on the interactions, the communication, and just readjusting as you go and watching it shift and evolve instead of having a finish line, because culture doesn't have a finish line.
I think there is a couple of ways, though, to speed up that. I think we all know that, in combat, units tend to be so much better. And culture is just, it's right on their fingertips all the time. And you go, well, we developed that in 8 months, and here we are successfully, doing things that no one thought we could do. And I think there's probably two factors to that. One is we never change the mission, right? We set the goals, here's the mission, here's the values, and we do not adjust. Leaders that change and go back and forth between what they really want tend to sabotage their own cultural change, right? And then the second thing is people change. In an organization that goes downrange, no one changes. So you can now derive it individually over and over again, amplifying it, reinforcing it, and it happens quickly. But in most organizations, there's always people change. So as much as you can reduce people change within your organization and retention, right? So keeping those people on help you speed this process up a little bit.
And how do you turn that into a series of habits where someone new comes into the organization and they see those habit repetitions and they feel some of that peer interaction, and then it becomes infectious? And those can be purposefully built into the organization.
Absolutely.
And then it's as if you were always there.
So I heard very deliberate actions, communicate the goals in the North Star, be consistent, have the commitment to that individually and collectively for the organization to ultimately change over time because everybody feels as they belong and are striving together.
That's the ideal.
Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts on culture.